Welcome back, fellow curious minds. Thank you for joining me once again. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore another fascinating story together. Picture this. The year is 585 before Christ. Two massive armies face each other across a blood-soaked battlefield in what is now Turkey. The Lydians and the Medes have been locked in a vicious war for 6 years. Thousands are already dead. But as the warriors raise their swords for another day of slaughter, something impossible happens. The sun begins to disappear. In the middle of the day, darkness creeps across the sky, like a giant hand closing over the world. Soldiers on both sides throw down their weapons and flee in terror. This has to be a sign from the gods. The war must end immediately. But one man saw this coming. A Greek philosopher named Thales had predicted this eclipse months in advance. While everyone else saw divine intervention, he saw mathematics and astronomy. And in that moment, when an old merchant from the city of Miletus proved he could predict the heavens using reason instead of prayer, Western philosophy was born. Today, we're diving into one of the most revolutionary periods in human history. The 6th century before Christ, when a handful of Greek thinkers in the wealthy cities of what we now call Turkey asked a question that changed everything. Not which god controls the weather or what ritual will bring rain, but something far more dangerous. What is everything actually made of? These men, who we call the Pre-Socratic philosophers, weren't trying to destroy religion, but they accidentally created something that would eventually challenge every assumption humans had ever made about reality. They invented the idea that you could understand the universe through thinking, rather than just through stories about gods and heroes. And it all started in the most unlikely place. Not in Athens, which wouldn't become philosophically important for another century, but in the bustling trading ports of Ionia, where Greek merchants rubbed shoulders with Persians, Babylonians, and Egyptians, where unprecedented wealth gave some people the luxury of asking questions that had no immediate practical value. The story begins in Miletus, the richest city in the Greek world around 600 before Christ. This wasn't the Greece of Spartan warriors or Athenian democracy. This was a Greece of merchant princes and international trade, where ships arrived daily, carrying not just silk and spices, but ideas from across the known world. Into this cosmopolitan environment was born a man who would later be called the first philosopher in history. Thales of Miletus wasn't trying to start a revolution in human thinking. He was just a curious man with a practical mind who happened to ask the right questions at the right time. What made Thales different wasn't that he was smarter than everyone else. It was that he lived in a world where different cultures offered competing explanations for everything. The Babylonians had their creation myths. The Egyptians had theirs. The Greeks had the stories of Hesiod, where the world emerged from primordial chaos through the violent struggles of gods and titans. But Thales had traveled. He had studied Egyptian mathematics and Babylonian astronomy. He had learned to calculate the height of the pyramids using shadows and geometry. He had figured out how to predict eclipses using numerical patterns rather than divine signs. All this practical experience with mathematics and observation led him to ask a revolutionary question. What if there's a natural explanation for everything? Now, this doesn't mean Thales was an atheist. He famously declared that all things are full of gods. But when he tried to explain why earthquakes happen, he didn't invoke Poseidon's anger. Instead, he proposed that the earth floats on water, and earthquakes occur when that water becomes turbulent. This was completely wrong, of course, but it was wrong in a completely new way. For the first time in recorded history, Someone was trying to explain natural phenomena through natural causes rather than supernatural ones. This led Thales to an even more radical idea. If everything can be explained naturally, then maybe everything in the universe comes from the same basic substance. Maybe there's one fundamental building block that transforms itself into rocks and trees and animals and humans and stars. Thales looked around at the world and made his best guess. Water. Think about it from his perspective. Water can be solid ice, liquid water, or invisible vapor. It's essential for all life. The earth seems to float on the ocean. Rain falls from the sky to nourish the land. If you had to pick one substance that seems to be everywhere and can take every form, water isn't a terrible guess. But here's what's really revolutionary about Thales' insight. He had introduced the concept that would drive the next 2 centuries of philosophical thinking, the idea of the arche, the fundamental principle or substance from which everything else emerges. Actually, it was Thales' student Anaximander who coined the term arche. But Anaximander thought his teacher's answer was too simple. Water is just one element among many. The real source of everything had to be something more fundamental, something boundless and indefinite that could become water or earth or air or fire without being limited by the properties of any of them. Anaximander called this ultimate substance the apeiron, meaning the boundless or the infinite. From this cosmic storehouse, he argued, opposite forces like hot and cold, wet and dry, would separate out and combine in different proportions to create all the things we see in the world. But Anaximander wasn't just theorizing about abstract substances. He was also trying to solve practical problems. He created the first map of the known world. He introduced the sundial to Greece. He proposed that the Earth hangs freely in space, held in place not by sitting on something, but by being equidistant from everything else. This is extraordinary thinking for someone living 26 centuries ago. Anaximander was basically inventing the scientific method without realizing it. Observe the world, propose explanations based on natural causes, test those explanations against further observations. But the third philosopher from Miletus, Anaximenes, thought both his predecessors had missed something important. If you're looking for a substance that can transform into everything else, why not choose something you can actually observe transforming? Anaximenes proposed air as the fundamental element. When air is compressed, it becomes denser and eventually turns into water, then earth, then stones. When air is expanded, it becomes thinner and turns into fire. You can see this happening when you breathe on a cold day. The air from your warm lungs becomes visible water vapor in the cold atmosphere. This might sound primitive to us, but Anaximenes was developing the first systematic theory of how one substance could become all others through purely physical processes. No gods required, just condensation and rarefaction, compression and expansion. These 3 men from Miletus had established something unprecedented in human history. The idea that the universe operates according to discoverable natural laws rather than the unpredictable whims of supernatural beings. But about 50 miles south of Miletus, in the wealthy port city of Ephesus, another philosopher was watching these developments with fascination and frustration. His name was Heraclitus, and he thought the Milesians had the right idea, but the wrong answer. Heraclitus came from one of the wealthiest families in Ephesus. He could have spent his life enjoying luxury and political power. Instead, he became obsessed with a problem that would consume his entire intellectual life. If everything is constantly changing, how can anything have a permanent nature? Look around, Heraclitus said. Nothing stays the same for even a moment. Your body is different now than it was when you started listening to this. The river flowing past your city contains completely different water than it did yesterday. Even the mountains are slowly wearing away grain by grain. This led Heraclitus to his most famous insight. You cannot step into the same river twice. Not because you've changed, though you have, but because the river itself is never the same. It's a constantly flowing process, masquerading as a permanent thing. But here's where Heraclitus got really interesting. If everything is constantly changing, what makes change possible in the first place? There has to be some kind of tension, some conflict or opposition that drives transformation. Heraclitus called this fundamental opposition the way up and down. Hot things cool down, cold things heat up, living things die and decay into soil that nourishes new living things. Day turns into night, turns into day. The universe is like a giant bow or a lyre, held in dynamic tension by opposing forces. And what element best represents this constant tension and transformation? Fire. Think about fire from Heraclitus's perspective. It's never the same from moment to moment, yet it maintains a recognizable pattern. It consumes other substances and transforms them into light and heat and ash. It can be almost invisible or blazingly obvious. It needs fuel to survive, but destroys that fuel in the process of living. Fire, for Heraclitus, wasn't just the fundamental substance. It was the perfect symbol for the cosmic principle that everything is process, not thing. Everything flows. Everything changes. Everything is fire. But Heraclitus wasn't content to just propose fire as his arch. He wanted to understand the deeper pattern that governs all this change. Here, he made one of the most important conceptual breakthroughs in human history. Behind all the apparent chaos and conflict in the world, Heraclitus argued, there's a universal reason or logic that keeps everything in balance. He called this principle logos, meaning word, or reason, or proportion. The logos ensures that for every movement in one direction, there's an equal movement in the opposite direction. For every birth, a death. For every winter, a summer. For every war, a peace. This idea that there are rational principles governing the universe, principles that human reason can discover and understand, would become foundational to all subsequent Western philosophy and science, from the Stoics to medieval theologians to modern physicists. The notion that the universe operates according to mathematical laws rather than arbitrary divine commands traces back to Heraclitus. But Heraclitus was also deeply pessimistic about human beings' ability to recognize these patterns. Most people, he argued, are like sleepwalkers. They live their entire lives without ever waking up to the logos that surrounds them. They mistake appearances for reality, temporary stability for permanent truth, their own limited perspectives for universal wisdom. This earned Heraclitus a reputation as a misanthrope. Later, philosophers called him the weeping philosopher because he was supposedly so disgusted with human stupidity that he spent his time crying over it. The stories about his life become increasingly bizarre, probably because people enjoyed making fun of his arrogant and cryptic personality. According to one legend, Heraclitus became so disgusted with human society that he retreated to the mountains to live alone, eating grass and herbs like an animal. When he developed dropsy, a condition that causes the body to retain water, he decided to cure himself using his own philosophy. Since fire was the fundamental element and a dry soul is wisest, he allegedly buried himself in cow dung to draw the moisture out of his body. It didn't work. He died there, literally consumed by the contradictions of his own thinking. Whether or not this story is true, it captures something important about Heraclitus's intellectual legacy. He was brilliant enough to see patterns that others missed, but arrogant enough to think that insight made him superior to everyone else. He deliberately wrote in riddles and paradoxes, believing that truth should be difficult to grasp, and that most people didn't deserve to understand it anyway. This combination of profound insight and deliberate obscurity earned him the nickname the Dark One. His writing style influenced everyone from Stoic philosophers to Christian theologians to modern thinkers like Hegel and Heidegger. But it also made him almost impossible to understand, which may have been exactly what he wanted. Meanwhile, there's another story about Thales that perfectly captures the tension between practical wisdom and abstract thinking. One evening, while walking and studying the stars, Thales fell into a well. A servant girl helped him out, then laughed at him. "You're so eager to know what's happening in the sky," she said, "but you can't see what's right at your feet." This became the first recorded absent-minded professor joke in history. But here's the irony. This same man who fell into a well because he was thinking about astronomy was also the one who calculated the height of the Egyptian pyramids using nothing but shadows and geometry. He solved engineering problems that armies couldn't handle. He predicted eclipses that terrified kings into ending wars. The servant girl's joke reveals something important about how ordinary people viewed these early philosophers. They seemed impractical, detached from real life, obsessed with questions that had no obvious payoff. Why does it matter what everything is made of? What difference does it make whether the fundamental substance is water or air or fire? But these apparently useless questions were actually the most practical questions anyone had ever asked. By proposing that the universe operates according to discoverable natural laws, the Pre-Socratics were laying the foundation for every scientific and technological advance that would follow. When you use GPS to navigate, you're relying on principles that trace back to Anaximander's insight that the Earth hangs freely in space. When doctors understand that diseases have natural causes rather than supernatural ones, they're applying the same kind of thinking that led Thales to explain earthquakes through water, rather than Poseidon's anger. By around 450 before Christ, the great age of pre-Socratic philosophy was coming to an end. The wealthy Ionian cities that had nurtured these thinkers were under increasing pressure from the Persian Empire. Miletus itself was completely destroyed in 494 when the Persians crushed the Ionian revolt. But the ideas these philosophers had unleashed were already spreading across the Greek world. In southern Italy and Sicily, Pythagoras was exploring the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony and cosmic order. Parmenides was arguing that all change is illusion, and only eternal being is real. Democritus was proposing that everything is made of tiny, indivisible atoms moving in empty space. The question, what is everything made of, had generated dozens of competing answers. But more importantly, it had established a new way of approaching questions about reality. Instead of accepting traditional stories about gods and heroes, you could observe the world carefully, think about it systematically, and propose explanations based on natural causes rather than supernatural ones. This was the intellectual inheritance that would eventually reach Athens, where Socrates would redirect philosophical inquiry toward questions about how to live a good life. Plato would organize these insights into systematic theories about knowledge and reality. Aristotle would establish the methods of logic and natural science that would dominate Western education for over 2,000 years. But it all started with a handful of merchants and aristocrats in the cosmopolitan trading cities of 6th century Ionia, places where Greek curiosity met international commerce and unprecedented wealth, gave some people the luxury of asking questions that had no immediate practical payoff. What made their intellectual revolution possible? Several factors had to come together at exactly the right time and place. First, political independence. These Greek cities were autonomous enough to allow free inquiry, unlike the great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, where intellectual life was controlled by priestly bureaucracies. You could ask dangerous questions without being executed for blasphemy. Second, economic prosperity. Trade with the entire Mediterranean world had made these cities incredibly wealthy. Wealth meant leisure, and leisure meant some people could spend their time thinking about abstract problems instead of just trying to survive. Third, cultural diversity. In the trading ports of Ionia, you encountered Egyptians who said the world emerged from primordial waters, Babylonians who described cosmic battles between order and chaos, Persians with their own creation stories. When you hear 5 different explanations for the same phenomena, you start wondering which one is actually true. Fourth, practical knowledge. These weren't ivory tower intellectuals. Thales was a successful merchant and engineer. Anaximander created maps and navigational instruments. They had hands-on experience with mathematics and astronomy and mechanical problems. Their philosophical speculations grew out of practical engagement with the world. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they had what we might call intellectual courage. It takes tremendous bravery to look at the traditional stories that have satisfied your ancestors for centuries and say, I think there might be a better explanation. Thales might have been wrong about water being the fundamental element. Heraclitus might have been wrong about fire. But they were right about something far more important. The universe operates according to discoverable principles, rather than arbitrary supernatural commands. Human reason can uncover those principles through careful observation and systematic thinking. The search for understanding is valuable for its own sake, not just as a means to practical ends. These ideas seem obvious to us now, but they were revolutionary 26 centuries ago. They're still revolutionary in many parts of the world today, where religious or political authorities claim that certain questions shouldn't be asked, or that traditional answers shouldn't be challenged. The pre-Socratic philosophers remind us that intellectual freedom is both precious and fragile. It emerged in a specific time and place where political independence, economic prosperity, and cultural diversity created perfect conditions for a few individuals to ask dangerous questions about the nature of everything. Their questions are still our questions. What is everything made of? How does change work? What principles govern the universe? Why is there something rather than nothing? We have better tools now for investigating these mysteries, from particle accelerators to space telescopes to computer simulations. But we're still driven by the same fundamental curiosity that led Thales to propose water as the arch and Heraclitus to declare that you cannot step into the same river twice. Think about what they accomplished with nothing but careful observation and logical reasoning. No laboratories, no instruments, no mathematical formulas, just human intelligence applied to the evidence of the senses. Anaximander figured out that the Earth floats freely in space 21 centuries before Copernicus. Heraclitus understood that everything is process rather than substance 24 centuries before modern physics discovered that matter and energy are interchangeable. They weren't always right, but they were asking the right kinds of questions in the right kind of way. Instead of, which god should we pray to for rain? They asked, what natural processes cause precipitation? Instead of, what ritual will cure this disease? They asked, what are the natural causes of illness? Instead of, how can we appease the gods? They asked, how can we understand the world? The cosmos is still full of mysteries. Dark matter and dark energy make up 95% of the universe, and we have no idea what they actually are. Consciousness remains completely inexplicable. We still don't know why there's something rather than nothing, or whether our universe is one of infinitely many, or what happened before the Big Bang. The Pre-Socratics showed us that the best way to approach these mysteries isn't through resignation or dogma, but through the patient application of human reason to the evidence of our senses. They invented philosophy, not as an abstract academic exercise, but as the most practical activity imaginable, the ongoing human effort to understand what we are and where we came from, and what it all means. That effort began 26 centuries ago, when a Greek merchant looked up at a solar eclipse and realized he could predict the heavens using mathematics instead of prayer. It continues today every time someone asks why things are the way they are and refuses to accept that's just how it's always been as an answer. The Pre-Socratics taught us that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than any story we tell about it, but that strangeness and wonder are precisely what make it worth trying to understand. And that's where we'll leave things for today. Thank you for listening, as always. If this journey sparked your curiosity, there's plenty more to explore. So stay tuned. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and never stop looking back to understand the road ahead.